In the city of São Paulo, in a luxurious building on Avenida Faria Lima, lived Marcus Whitmore, a man whose life seemed straight out of a modern fairy tale. At 38, he was the kind of person everyone envied and wished they could be. Inheriting a huge fortune from his English family, Marcus ran a business empire in Brazil, but his real passion wasn't work, it was life. His days were filled with expensive dinners in starred restaurants, exclusive parties, and trips that took him to every corner of the world. He never cared about anything other than the present moment. He was a man who laughed out loud, who loved the sound of clinking champagne glasses, and who didn't need anyone to be happy. At least that's what he told everyone. But, as in any great story, behind a perfect facade, there was something no one could see. That December morning, the sun was shining high in the sky over São Paulo. Marcus was sitting on his large balcony with a breathtaking view. He was lazily leafing through a travel magazine while one of his assistants brought him his breakfast. "Mr. Whitmore, your itinerary to Aspen is confirmed. Departure on Christmas Eve, as usual. Would you like to go over the accommodation details?" He nodded absent-mindedly, adjusting his expensive sunglasses. Aspen was every year's destination, a haven of snow and luxury, where he and his best friend David escaped the Christmas mess and the sentimentality he despised so much. Marcus was an avowed cynic when it came to Christmas. For him, it was just an excuse for people to try to appear happier and more generous than they really were. He preferred the glitter of parties with booze and loud music to gift exchanges full of forced hugs and empty words. David, his inseparable friend, was the only one who could convince him to maintain any kind of tradition. For more than a decade, they had celebrated together in the same exclusive resort. David was more than a friend to Marcus, he was almost a brother. The two shared memories of trips, adventures, and above all escapes from the emotional responsibilities they both avoided. But that year, something was different. David had a strange tone on the phone when he called to confirm the details of the trip. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about Aspen," he said with unusual hesitation. "Talk about what? You know it's our tradition. You're not going to tell me you're giving up, are you?" Marcus laughed, but there was a hint of discomfort in his voice. On the other end of the line, David paused for far too long before answering. "I've met someone, Marcus, and I think I'm going to spend Christmas with her." The sentence crashed like thunder. "Someone?" Marcus repeated, incredulous. "David, you're joking, aren't you? It's our Christmas, it's our tradition." "I know, man, but I'm in love. I can't miss this moment with her." In love. The word sounded like an insult. Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "Ah, David, come on, love. That's for the naive. You know that better than anyone." But David didn't laugh. On the contrary, his voice took on a firm tone. "Maybe so, Marcus, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I should be." When the call ended, Marcus stood still, staring at the horizon with the phone still in his hand. He felt a mixture of disbelief and irritation. How could David abandon him for something so ephemeral? Love, relationships. For Marcus, these things were distractions, yet something deeper began to bother him. He was used to being left alone, but never by David. It was as if the world around him was beginning to show cracks that he didn't know how to mend. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has gone. In the days that followed, he tried to reorganize his plans. He looked for other friends to accompany him to Aspen, but they were all busy with their own families and celebrations. With each refusal, the emptiness grew. For the first time, Marcus began to realize how much he depended on that tradition with David to mask his own loneliness. On Christmas Eve, Marcus's mansion was as silent as ever. He had dismissed almost all the staff, claiming he wanted privacy. He only asked Rosa, his maid, to stay until he decided to have dinner. The dinner ordered from a very expensive restaurant was on the table, untouched. He walked through the huge corridors decorated with a dazzling Christmas tree, full of ornaments that meant nothing to him. The silence was deafening. Marcus opened a bottle of wine, but as he looked at the empty glass in front of him, he felt something he couldn't name. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration. It was something much deeper, much more uncomfortable. He tried to turn on the television, but every Christmas commercial seemed to mock him. Happiness in the family. Love is the greatest gift. He turned it off with an abrupt gesture and let himself sink into the sofa. That night, for the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight of his life. As much as he had everything, he felt something was missing. But what was it? He didn't know. Shortly before midnight, Rosa, his faithful maid, showed up saying she had to go home. Her family was waiting for her. She had worked for Marcus for years, and like a silent mother knew every detail of his routine, even the ones he tried to hide. "Are you spending Christmas alone, Mr. Marcus?" she asked, with a tone that mixed concern and affection. "By choice, Rosa. I prefer it that way." He tried to sound casual, but she wasn't convinced. "No one prefers to spend Christmas alone." Rosa looked at him with the eyes of someone who could see beyond the walls of arrogance he was erecting. For a moment, Marcus thought about sending her away, but her words kept echoing in his mind as she left. Alone. That's exactly how he felt. And then, outside the door, Rosa hesitated before turning and saying something that would change everything. "Why don't you spend Christmas with us at home? It's nothing grand, but it's from the heart." Marcus laughed nervously, ready to refuse, but something in her expression made him stop. "Think about it. It's not good for anyone to be alone tonight." And so Rosa left, leaving Marcus in the midst of silence and doubt. What Rosa didn't know, and even Marcus didn't understand, was that at that moment, a door had opened. A door that he dreaded going through, but that might be exactly what he needed to save himself from himself. What would Marcus do? The clock ticked. Emptiness was lurking, and fate, silent, awaited his decision. Marcus's mansion was plunged into a silence that seemed alive, suffocating. He stared at the vast living room where the Christmas decorations shone without purpose, and felt a tightness in his chest that he couldn't ignore. The luxurious furnishings, the blazing fireplace, the subtle aroma of the gourmet dinner that he himself didn't want to touch. It all seemed to mock him. It was an empty stage, a theatre without an audience. By instinct, his eyes landed on the balcony window. Outside, the city lights flickered on, revealing apartments full of families laughing and hugging, while he sank into his golden solitude. It was at that moment that something began to change. He remembered Rosa. Rosa had been with him for over a decade. From the moment he decided to come to Brazil to expand the family business, she had become a constant presence, almost invisible, but always there. Despite being a maid, Rosa was much more than someone who looked after the house. She was a silent pillar. Marcus didn't like to talk about his family. Growing up in London, in a home where appearances were more important than any emotional bond, he learned early on not to depend on anyone. His mother, a vain socialite, spent more time in beauty salons than with her children. His father, a cold and calculating tycoon, saw Marcus and his siblings only as extensions of his legacy. There were times in his childhood when he tried to get the attention of both of them. Once he spent weeks rehearsing a play at school, only to be left waiting in the audience while the other parents applauded their children. His parents didn't show up. They never did. The pain of rejection shaped him. He learned to expect nothing from anyone, to rely only on himself. When he inherited his fortune after his parents died in an accident, he cut ties with the few remaining family members and decided to start over in another country. In Brazil, he found freedom, but also a loneliness that he always tried to mask with parties and trips. Rosa was the first person to treat him with anything close to genuine affection. When he arrived in São Paulo, lost in a new country and not trusting anyone, it was she who ensured that his house became a home, even though he wouldn't admit it. She would ask simple questions, but loaded with meaning. "Have you eaten today, Mr. Marcus? Did you sleep well? Do you need anything?" He always answered coldly, but something in her tone of voice comforted him. She didn't do it out of obligation, but because she really seemed to care. That night, Rosa's words echoed in his mind. "Why don't you spend Christmas with us? It's nothing big, but it's from the heart." Marcus shook his head, trying to dismiss the idea, but the feeling of emptiness was unbearable. He looked at the table set with expensive china, the silverware gleaming in the chandelier light. It all seemed so lifeless. He took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. What did he have to lose? Spending Christmas alone, locked up in that huge house, would only make him revisit memories he wanted so much to forget. At least with Rosa and her family, he would be surrounded by voices, laughter, and perhaps a little human warmth. Picking up the phone, he hesitated for a second before dialing. Rosa answered with surprise. "Mr. Marcus, has something happened?" "Wait. Where are you? Don't go yet." "Excuse me, sir? I'm coming with you." The sentence came out before he could regret it. "Wait for me there in the square by the bus stop." On the other end of the line, Rosa was silent for a moment. Then, with a mixture of surprise and joy, she replied, "Of course, Mr. Marcus. I'll be waiting." After hanging up the phone, Marcus stood up with a determination he hadn't felt for a long time. He walked over to the dining room table, where the dinner he had ordered was still intact, and put everything in containers. He picked up a box of imported chocolates that he had bought to give to a client and separated a few bottles of wine. As she passed through the living room, she saw some wrapped presents that had been there since the beginning of the month. They were for business colleagues, but now they had a different destination. Putting on a coat, he picked up the bags and left. The cool night air hit him like a shock, but it also invigorated him. As he approached the gate, he got into his car, which was parked there, drove for a few minutes and saw Rosa standing at the bus stop, holding a small bag. She was wearing a simple coat, but was impeccably dressed, as always. "I can't believe you actually came," she said as she got into the car, smiling with surprise. "Yeah, me neither." Marcus tried to disguise his surprise with a humorous tone. "But here I am. So, shall we go?" She pointed to the road, and he nodded. As they drove along the almost deserted roads, Rosa talked about what was waiting for her at home. "My daughter, Clara, organizes everything. She's very dedicated, you know. She decorates the house, cooks, organizes the games." Marcus listened, but his mind wandered. He wasn't used to being included in something so simple. It was as if that small gesture had pulled him out of a bubble he had created for himself. The journey took about 20 minutes. When they arrived, Marcus stopped for a moment and looked at Rosa's house. It was modest, but there was a special charm about it. Christmas lights twinkled in the window, and the smell of home-cooked food wafted through the ajar door. "Welcome, Mr. Marcus," said Rosa, with a smile that mixed gratitude and pride. He took a deep breath before entering. When Marcus crossed the threshold, he felt a warmth that didn't just come from the surroundings, but from the energy emanating from the house. He could hear laughter coming from the living room, excited voices talking about supper, and in the background the sound of Christmas music playing softly. And then, in the midst of the pleasant chaos, he saw Clara. She turned to look who had arrived, and her eyes met his. There was something in her smile that disconcerted him. He didn't know it, but his life was about to change forever. Marcus took a few hesitant steps through the small, cozy living room of Rosa's house. It felt like a completely different universe from his cold and lonely mansion. There the air was warm, and the energy was vibrant. The house was full of small details that showed care and love. Simple handmade paper ornaments, colored lights that flashed with a disorganized rhythm, and a table set with dishes that exuded a comforting aroma. But it wasn't the setting that caught his attention. It was the young woman walking around the room, laughing as she arranged a set of improvised presents next to a small Christmas tree. Clara. She turned around when she heard the footsteps of her mother and Marcus. Her face, illuminated by the flashing lights, had a serene, almost unpretentious beauty. Her hair was tied up in a simple bun, and her eyes sparkled as if they carried all the joy of the evening. "Ah, you must be the famous Mr. Marcus," she said, with a sincere smile that disarmed any resistance he might have had. For a moment, Marcus was speechless. It wasn't just Clara's appearance that impressed him, but the way she seemed genuinely happy to see him there, even though he was a stranger. "Yes, and you must be Clara," he replied, making an effort to look more at ease than he really was. Clara walked up to him, extending her hand in greeting. "Welcome. I hope you don't mind the mess. Here, we do Christmas our way." Marcus shook her hand, feeling the firmness and simplicity of the gesture. "Messy sounds perfect." While Rosa went to the kitchen to help with the preparations, Marcus stayed in the living room with Clara and her younger siblings, who were running around excitedly, laughing and playing with paper props. Clara watched the scene with affection, but also with the responsibility of someone who knew she was the foundation of that family. "You have an incredible family," said Marcus, breaking the silence. Clara laughed lightly. "Thank you, they're intense, but I wouldn't swap them for anything." And you organize all this? Almost everything. My mother does her best, but I like to get involved. I think Christmas is more special when you make the effort to create unforgettable moments, even if they're simple. That phrase kept echoing in Marcus's mind. It was so different from what he was used to, so opposite to the superficial world he had built for himself. The celebration began shortly afterwards. Sitting around the table, Marcus was formally introduced to the family. There was something comforting about the joyful chaos of the atmosphere. The children were talking loudly. Rosa was trying to maintain order with a loving authority, and Clara was orchestrating everything with a patient smile. When it was time for games, Clara brought out an old deck of cards and proposed a game of questions and answers. "It's a tradition here," she explained. "Everyone answers something personal. No lies, huh?" With each round, Marcus found himself laughing more, opening up more. When it was his turn, one of the children asked, "Do you have a big family?" He hesitated, his smile disappearing for a moment. He felt Clara's gaze on him, but instead of discomfort, there was curiosity and understanding. "No, not anymore," he answered truthfully. "My family was complicated." Clara realized that there was something behind that short answer, but instead of pressuring him, she skillfully changed the course of the conversation. "Well, now you have at least one night with our family, and I warn you, we can be very noisy, but we promise not to bite," she said, drawing laughter from everyone. After the jokes came the exchange of gifts. There was no luxury in the wrapping, but there was genuine emotion in every smile and hug. Marcus watched with a mixture of surprise and admiration. When it was his turn, he handed the children the boxes of chocolates he had brought, and the sparkle in their eyes was an unexpected reward. Clara received a small gift that Marcus had bought for one of the suppliers, a simple bookmark with a motivational phrase. "Always believe in your dreams," it said. Clara smiled as she opened it. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus. Looks like someone told my mom how much I like to read. I only brought the present without even knowing you. It was just a coincidence. I could have chosen something better, but since it wasn't planned, I hope you like it because I'm giving it to you with a lot of affection," he replied, trying not to show how impressed he was with the way she received something so simple with so much gratitude. Clara then picked up a guitar from the corner of the room and began to play a soft tune. The melody filled the room with a tranquility that seemed impossible in the midst of such contagious joy. Marcus couldn't take his eyes off her. It wasn't just her skill with the guitar, it was the way she put her heart into every chord, every word she sang. As the hours passed, the children gradually fell asleep, and even Rosa decided to rest, leaving Marcus and Clara alone in the living room. They sat on the sofa, with the soft light of the Christmas tree illuminating the room. "You look surprised," said Clara, after a long moment of silence. "At what?" "At all this, as if you didn't expect that something so simple could be good." Marcus laughed, but it was a melancholy laugh. "I think you're right. I'm not used to this. My life has always been more about excesses. But excesses don't fill you up, do they?" He stared at her, surprised by the depth of her question. "No," she finally answered. "They don't." Clara smiled but said nothing. It was as if she understood that he needed that silence to process his own thoughts. "What about you?" he asked, changing focus. "Don't you miss something more? Trips, parties, all those things I thought were indispensable." "I have everything I need," she replied, with disarming simplicity. "My family, my dreams, my faith that good things happen to those who seek them." Marcus fell silent again. For the first time in years, he felt a peace that didn't come from possessions or achievements, but from a true connection with someone. He felt something different. It wasn't just gratitude, it was something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. Rosa's house was completely silent. The clock on the wall chimed almost 5 in the morning, but Marcus and Clara remained in the living room, sitting next to each other on the sofa. The soft light of the Christmas tree was still flickering, casting delicate shadows in the room. Outside, the city was beginning to fall asleep, but inside the house, something deeper was awakening. Clara was barefoot and holding a mug of hot tea that she had prepared minutes before. Marcus, next to her, was holding a glass of water, but he was hardly aware that he had it. His eyes were fixed on her as she spoke, each word revealing a piece of her soul. "Have you always been so detached?" Clara asked with a slightly teasing tone, but her eyes were serious. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. I wouldn't say it's detachment. Maybe it's, protection. When you get used to losing important things, stopping clinging seems easier. Clara tilted her head, studying him. Lose how? He hesitated, but for the first time in years he felt he could be honest. My parents were never affectionate. They didn't have time for it. When they died, I realized there wasn't much to mourn. It was like losing a habit, not a real connection. That must have been hard, said Clara, with an empathy that made Marcus look away. He wasn't used to receiving this kind of understanding, especially from someone he barely knew. And you? He asked, trying to shift the focus. Have you always been this optimistic? Clara laughed softly. Not always, but I've learned to be. Growing up with little teaches you to value what really matters. My mother was always a warrior, you know. She went out of her way to ensure that my siblings and I never felt less than special, even when we barely had enough for dinner. I think I inherited that from her. Marcus smiled for the first time in that conversation, but it wasn't the arrogant smile of before. It was a real smile, full of admiration. You're special, that's obvious. Clara looked away for a moment, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. The silence that settled in wasn't uncomfortable, but full of something they both felt, but couldn't yet name. Hours passed without them realizing it. They talked about everything, about Clara's dreams of becoming a teacher, about Marcus's travels around the world, about difficult moments and small triumphs that marked their lives. As the sunlight began to break through the curtains, Clara yawned, covering her mouth with her hand. God, it's so late. Or early. Marcus smiled. I don't think you'll ever sleep if it's up to me. And he came closer to her. Clara stood up, straightening her blouse. I really need to rest. Today we still have to organize everything for lunch. My mother won't forgive me if I get sleepy. Marcus stood up too, feeling a strange reluctance to let her go. Clara, he began, but hesitated. Yes? I know this is a bit impulsive, but I'd like to invite you to have dinner with me tomorrow. Just the two of us. After all this is over, I'd like to talk to you more. Clara looked at him with surprise, but also with something that seemed like gratitude. I'll think about it. Let's see how the day unfolds. I'll take that as a yes, he said, trying to sound confident, but there was genuine anxiety in his voice. She smiled before disappearing down the corridor, leaving Marcus alone in the living room. He sat down again, watching the Christmas tree lights gradually fade with the sunrise. Something had changed inside him, something he couldn't ignore. Then Marcus got up and left. He felt he needed to sleep. In the late afternoon, when the Christmas celebrations at Rosa's house were over, Clara finally accepted Marcus's invitation. He took her to a small restaurant he had found on the outskirts of the neighborhood. It wasn't as luxurious as the places he used to frequent, but it was cozy, with a calm atmosphere that seemed ideal for this conversation. It's strange being here with you, Clara admitted, looking at him from across the table. Why? Because you don't look like someone who would feel comfortable in a place like this. Simple, ordinary. Marcus raised an eyebrow defiantly. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think. Maybe not, she replied, with a smile that disarmed him once again. Over dinner, the conversation flowed as naturally as it had the night before. Clara talked about her plans to finish college, about how she dreamed of teaching children from underprivileged communities. Marcus listened to her with an attentiveness he didn't know he could offer anyone. And you? Asked Clara after a while. What's your dream, Marcus? He laughed, but it was a melancholy laugh. I don't know if I have a dream. I think I've spent so much time chasing things I thought I wanted that I've never stopped to think about what really matters. Maybe it's time to find out, Clara said simply. After dinner, Marcus drove her home, but instead of leaving, he stood outside for a few minutes thinking. The conversation with Clara had moved him in a way that no other person had been able to before. He realized that his life until then had been a constant search for validation, for something to fill the void he had felt since childhood. But no amount of money, travel, or luxury had been able to do that. Clara, with her kindness and simplicity, was showing him that perhaps there was another way. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew he didn't want to lose what he was beginning to feel. That night, Marcus returned to his mansion, but he didn't feel the same emptiness as before. Something was different. He stood in front of the Christmas tree that was still set up in his living room, the lights flickering softly. He thought of Clara, her smile, the way she talked about life, the dreams she shared without fear. For the first time in years, Marcus felt that it might be possible to find something real, something that wasn't ephemeral. But was he ready for that? Did he know how? The answer wasn't coming, but he knew that the search was just beginning. The days following that Christmas Eve were like a rebirth for Marcus. He started going to Rosa's house more regularly, always bringing something. Chocolates for the children, flowers for Rosa, or sometimes nothing but his presence. He was allowing himself to be immersed in a completely different world from the one he knew, a world where simplicity and affection were more valuable than any cipher he owned. But it wasn't just Rosa's house that attracted him. Clara, with her serene kindness and simple, honest outlook on life, had become the center of Marcus's thoughts. He tried not to show it too much, but his desire to see and hear her made him find excuses to drop by. One day, Rosa, who was watching everything with attentive eyes, back at the mansion and far away from Clara, could no longer ignore what was happening. "Mr. Marcus," she said, as she set the table for dinner, "you've been very present at my house lately. Has anything changed?" He looked at her with a half-hearted smile. "Maybe I've discovered that I like it better there than here in my own house." Rosa paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on him, trying to decipher what lay behind those words. Like a protective mother, she began to feel a twinge of worry. "And Clara?" she asked hesitantly. "I hope you know that she's a girl with a very pure heart. I just hope you'll be careful." Marcus understood what Rosa meant. He knew his reputation wasn't the best. After all, he had always been known as a man of parties and superficial relationships. But for the first time, he felt the need to prove that he was capable of being different. "Rosa," he said with a sincerity that surprised even himself, "I don't really know what I'm doing, but I can promise you one thing. I would never hurt your daughter." As the weeks went by, Marcus's visits to Rosa's house became part of the routine. He began to take part in simple activities. He helped wash the dishes, played cards with the children, and even accompanied Rosa to the market, carrying the bags as if it were an old habit, something that in his mind as a millionaire and many others couldn't even pass. How could he, with so much money, be there doing these simple tasks? These small gestures didn't go unnoticed by Clara, who saw a side of him that few people knew. One evening, while they were both sitting in the backyard, Clara looked at him with a shy smile. "You don't look like the same man I met that Christmas Eve," she said, almost jokingly. Marcus raised an eyebrow, curious. "Is that good or bad?" Interesting." "Interesting." He leaned forward slightly with a challenging smile. "I need to improve my reputation with you." Clara laughed, but her smile soon turned serious. "What made you change, Marcus?" He hesitated before answering, but he knew he couldn't run away from the truth. "You, Clara, you and your family. You showed me something I never knew I wanted, a real home." Clara remained silent, but her heart beat faster. She knew she was beginning to fall in love with him, but she also knew that Marcus still carried parts of his past that could hurt her. Rosa, who watched the growing closeness between Marcus and Clara from afar, couldn't ignore her unease. One evening, while Clara was putting away the dishes after dinner, Rosa decided to broach the subject. "Clara, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Mom. What is it?" "You and Mr. Marcus, you've been spending a lot of time together. Is it something serious?" Clara paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know, Mom. He's different from what I expected. He makes me feel things I've never felt before, but you're afraid," Rosa added. Clara nodded. "He's so different from me, and sometimes I think that can be a problem." Rosa put a hand on her daughter's shoulder, looking worried. "I just want you to be happy, my child, but I don't want your heart to be hurt. Men like him have a way of complicating things." Clara didn't reply, but her mother's words echoed in her mind for the next few days. A few days later, Marcus showed up at Rosa's house earlier than usual, bringing Clara a bouquet of flowers. New Year's Eve was only a few days away, and Marcus was loving this routine. She welcomed him with a surprised smile, but couldn't hide the shyness she felt when they were alone. They went for a walk around the neighborhood, talking about life, dreams, and the little things that made them smile. When they reached a quiet little square, Marcus stopped and looked at Clara. "Clara, I need to tell you something. Say it. Since I met you, my life has changed completely. You make me want to be someone better, someone worthy of you." Clara felt tears forming in her eyes, but she couldn't speak. Marcus approached her slowly, his eyes fixed on hers, and before she could hesitate, he kissed her. It was a soft kiss, but full of emotion. When they pulled away, Clara looked at him, feeling that something irrevocable had happened between them. They stayed there for hours. Rosa began to notice that Marcus was really changing. He had stopped going to the parties he loved so much, avoided his old social circles, and instead devoted his time to Clara and her family. In less than a week, he had already changed so much. He also started getting involved in social work, something he had never done before, donating toys to children living on the street. One day, Rosa watched him helping one of the children with his homework and felt a mixture of relief and hope. Maybe he would be able to make his daughter happy after all. "You look different, Mr. Marcus," she said as he got up to get a glass of water. "How different? More human?" He smiled but didn't answer. Although Marcus and Clara were growing closer, the difference in their worlds began to show. One day, while they were together in the living room, Marcus received a call from his friend David, inviting him to a party. He turned him down immediately, but Clara noticed the hesitation in his voice. "Do you miss your old life?" Marcus didn't answer. He talked about something else and then went home. The next morning began quietly at Marcus's house. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the empty weight of the luxurious routine he used to carry. Clara had transformed his life in a way he had never imagined possible. There was love, simplicity, and purpose in his days. He was sitting in his living room, reading a book that Clara had recommended, when the phone rang. It was 2 days before the New Year. The number on the screen was familiar. David, his longtime friend. Marcus hesitated before answering. It had been days since the last meaningful conversation between the two of them, and the memory of the cancelled trip to Aspen still lingered in his mind. "David," Marcus answered with a friendly tone. "Marcus, my friend, I need to tell you something." David's voice was full of frustration. "It's over. It's all over with Mariana. It didn't work out. She was amazing, but it wasn't meant to be, you know. Christmas Eve with her was really nice, but nothing compares to the parties back in Aspen." Marcus was silent for a moment, processing his friend's confession. "I'm sorry, David. Relationships are complicated." "Complicated?" David laughed bitterly. "Let it go. Listen, I was thinking, how about we resume our plans? Aspen, not Christmas, but New Year's Eve, just like old times. Just the two of us, no drama, no love affairs, just fun. Lots of women and partying every day. It'll be just like before, Marcus." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, trying to find the right words. "I'm not going, David. This year is going to be different for me." On the other end of the line, David laughed, but there was disbelief in his voice. "You're joking, aren't you? That's it, isn't it? You're trying to get even because I cancelled Christmas. Dude, stop playing games. It doesn't suit you." "It's not revenge," Marcus replied firmly. "It's just my life has changed, David. Since Christmas Eve, when I was alone, a lot has changed. I'm not the same man anymore." The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, David answered with a tone full of skepticism. "How has it changed? What do you mean, Marcus?" "It's complicated. If you want, we can talk about it another day. But Aspen, it's not going to happen for me this year, and not any time soon, I hope." David mumbled something inaudible before hanging up abruptly, leaving Marcus with the feeling that this story wasn't over yet. The next day, Marcus was in the kitchen of the mansion, helping Rosa make a list to prepare lunch. He felt comfortable there, something he would have found impossible months ago. He was talking to Rosa about Clara's future, encouraging her to resume her studies, when the insistent sound of the doorbell echoed through the house. "It must be a package," said Rosa, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll get it," said Marcus, heading for the door. When he opened it, he found David standing there with a look of curiosity and irritation. He was wearing his typical elegant suit, but his posture showed impatience. "David," Marcus began, surprised, "what are you doing here?" "I decided to come in person because you seem to be talking garbage on the phone," said David, entering uninvited. "We need to talk." Marcus sighed, closing the door behind him. David, I told you that I'm not interested in that kind of life anymore. I'm not here to talk about travel, David interrupted, his tone more incisive. I want to know what's going on with you. You're not the Marcus I know. What's changed? Before Marcus could answer, David began to observe Marcus with a critical eye. He realized that something had changed. He no longer looked like the Marcus he had before. Wait a minute, he said with an incredulous laugh. Is it true what I heard the other day? That you're involved with your maid's daughter? What did she do in a week that left you like this? Marcus's silence was answer enough. David shook his head, stunned. You've got to be out of your mind, Marcus. Do you have any idea what you're doing? These women, they know how to play the game. Of course she's using you. This is a scam, and you're falling for it. In the kitchen, Rosa heard every word. She had gone back to get something from the cupboard next to the living room, and accidentally overheard the conversation. David's words were like knives through her heart. Strike. Those women. She sat down at the kitchen table, holding her head with her hands. Rosa knew that Marcus was a man of the world, but she had never imagined that his involvement with Clara could cause so much judgment. She feared that deep down, David's words carried a weight that Marcus couldn't ignore. Her eyes began to tear up as she thought about the possibility of her daughter being hurt in this story. Clara doesn't deserve this, she muttered to herself. In the living room, Marcus clenched his fists, trying to contain the anger that rose up inside him. He looked at David, who was staring at him with a mixture of concern and contempt. Enough, David, he said with a cold tone. I'm not going to let you talk like that about Clara or Rosa. You don't know anything about them. I know enough to understand what's going on, David retorted. You're blind, they're manipulating you, Marcus, it's obvious. I think it's time you left. David opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus's gaze was firm, unwavering. With a frustrated sigh, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. You're making a mistake, Marcus, and when you realize it, it'll be too late. Marcus didn't answer. He waited until the door had closed behind David before letting out a long sigh. He knew that his friend's words might have planted doubts, but there was no room for them in his heart. Marcus went into the kitchen and found Rosa still sitting there, her eyes red. He approached her slowly, taking a seat next to her. You heard, didn't you? He asked softly. Rosa nodded, unable to look him in the eye. Rosa, he began, taking her hands in his, I would never hurt Clara. Never. She's the best thing that ever happened in my life. But, Mr. Marcus, what if he's right? Whispered Rosa, finally looking up. You come from such a different world, and people will talk. I just want to protect my daughter. I understand, replied Marcus sincerely, but you have to trust me. I'm not playing with her heart. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. With Clara. With you. Rosa looked at him for a long moment, searching for the truth in his words. Finally, she nodded, but the worry was still on her face. While Rosa went back to work, Marcus stood alone in the kitchen, looking out of the window. He knew that the love he felt for Clara was real, but he also knew that he would face many barriers to prove it, to Rosa, to Clara, and perhaps even to himself. But the question that tormented him now was, did Clara also believe in him enough to face the world alongside him? That evening, Marcus's house seemed quieter than usual. Rosa had left a little earlier, and Clara, on hearing that her mother was down, sent a brief but worried message. Is everything okay? My mother seemed distant when she arrived. Marcus looked at the screen of his cell phone, feeling a heaviness in his chest. He knew that the conversation with David had left its mark, both on Rosa and on himself. Clara was everything he wanted, but the world seemed willing to test every aspect of his relationship with her. Yes, it's all right. We'll talk tomorrow, he replied, without the courage to bring up what had happened. Clara deserved to know, but he wanted to find the right moment to explain everything. The next day, Marcus decided to go to Rosa's house early. He knew he needed to clear things up, not only with Rosa but also with Clara. He didn't want any doubts planted by David to spread. When he arrived, Rosa welcomed him with a shy smile, but Marcus realized that there was an emotional distance that hadn't existed before. He left the car in the street and went inside, carrying a bag with some bread and sweets he had bought on the way. Clara's in there, said Rosa, pointing to the living room. Clara was sitting on the sofa reading a book. When she saw him, she closed the book and stood up with a warm smile. "You're early," she said, hugging him. "I needed to see you," he replied, holding her for longer than usual. She noticed the serious tone in his voice and pulled him down to sit on the sofa. "What happened?" Marcus took a deep breath before beginning. "Yesterday, David came to my house. He didn't say nice things, Clara. In fact, he insinuated that you and your mother had bad intentions towards me, that it was all a scam." Clara stared at him, surprised and offended at the same time. She stood up, pacing the room. "What about you? What do you think about it?" "I think he's wrong," Marcus replied firmly. "I trust you, Clara, more than I've ever trusted anyone. But I needed to tell you because I know those words might come back to you somehow." Clara sat down next to him, her eyes full of tears. "Do you know what hurts the most? It's not his words. It's the fact that, because of your world, I'll always need to prove that I'm good enough to be with you, that what I feel for you is real." Marcus held her hands, looking her straight in the eye. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Clara. Not to David, not to the world, and definitely not to me. I see you. I know who you are." Clara let a tear fall but smiled slightly. "It's hard, Marcus, but I want to face it alongside you." While Marcus and Clara talked in the living room, Rosa was in the kitchen, listening to everything. Clara's words cut her deeply. She knew her daughter was telling the truth, but she also knew how cruel the world could be. Rosa remembered the difficult moments she had faced throughout her life, the doors that had been closed to her because she was a woman, because she was poor, because she was a single mother. She knew how people judged without knowing the truth. Seeing Marcus enter the kitchen soon after, Rosa tried to hide her worried expression, but he noticed immediately. "Rosa," he began, with the gentle tone she was beginning to recognize, "I need you to know that I will never hurt Clara. Ever." Rosa sighed, finally releasing the words she had been holding back. "Mr. Marcus, it's not just you, it's what you represent. I'm afraid that Clara's love for you will put her in a position she can't bear. The world is cruel to those from below. It always has been." Marcus felt the weight of these words. "I understand, Rosa, but since I met Clara, my life has taken on a meaning it never had before. She's made me realize that I don't just want to be what the world expects of me. I want to be someone better, someone worthy of her." Rosa stared at him, evaluating his words. "I believe in you, but change needs to come from within. If it's real, Clara will feel it." Marcus nodded, knowing that Rosa was right. The next day, New Year's Eve, Marcus devoted himself even more to Clara and her family. They celebrated the arrival of the new year together and promised that nothing would affect their love. Marcus began to find ways to help Rosa discreetly, offering support without making her feel like she was being bought. But as they grew closer, rumors began to circulate. David, feeling betrayed by Marcus's attitude, spread the story among mutual friends, and soon the situation reached social media. David couldn't understand how Marcus had given up going to Aspen to spend New Year's Eve in a simple house with his housekeeper and her family. So he thought he had to do something to help his friend wake up from this delusion. A gossip website broke the news that Marcus Whitmore, the country's most eligible bachelor, was involved with a simple maid. The comments were cruel, and public humiliation seemed inevitable. When Clara saw the news, she was shocked. Rosa, for her part, remained silent, but her expression said it all. Marcus knew he had to act quickly to protect them, but he also knew that this could be the greatest test of love he would ever face in his life. That night, Marcus faced his own image in the mirror, seeing a man torn between the world he had built and the love that had transformed him. He knew he would face even more challenges, but one thing was certain: he was willing to fight for Clara. But would their love be strong enough to withstand the pressures of the world? Or would the shadows of Marcus's past and society's prejudices destroy what they were building together? The news spreading across the internet hit Clara like a storm. For the first time, she felt the real weight of being by Marcus's side. Sitting on the sofa at home, cell phone in hand, she read the comments that seemed to echo her greatest fears. She just wants his money. "This maid has been planning this all her life. Clara, you need to stop reading these things," said Rosa, holding her daughter's hand. "These people know nothing about you, nothing about us." "Mom, what if they're right? I don't belong in this world. I just wanted to love you, but it seems like that will never be enough," replied Clara, struggling to hold back tears. Rosa took a deep breath, squeezing her daughter's hand tighter. "My child, what matters is how you both feel. If your love is true, you'll get through all this." Although she tried to remain firm, Clara felt her heart squeeze. Loving Marcus was the best thing that had ever happened to her, but the price seemed too high. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. Clara's face, marked by sadness, haunted his thoughts. He knew that her exposure was the fault of the world he lived in, but he also knew that he had to act to protect her. Sitting in his office, cell phone in hand, he made a decision. He turned on the camera and started recording. "Good evening, I'm Marcus Whitmore, and this is a video I never imagined I would make. Over the last few days, a lot of things have been said about me and Clara, the woman I love, and I'm here to tell our story." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I met Clara on Christmas Eve. I was lost, alone in my empty mansion, when her mother, Rosa, my maid for years, invited me to spend the night with their family. It was the best decision I ever made. In that simple house I found something I had never experienced before: true love, human warmth, and the joy of being surrounded by people who care about each other." He looked straight into the camera, his gaze serious and sincere. "Clara isn't with me out of interest. She's with me because she loves me, and I love her. She showed me what really matters in life, and I won't let lies or prejudice tarnish what we have." Marcus ended the video with a slight but firm smile. "I know the world can be cruel, but if you've ever really loved someone, I urge you to share this message. Love is the most valuable thing we have, and I will never give it up." The video was posted on Marcus's social media that early morning. He didn't expect much, perhaps a few messages of support from his closest friends. But as dawn broke, he realized that something bigger was happening. The video had gone viral. Millions of views in just a few hours. People from all over Brazil were sharing the story, often with emotional messages. "Their love is too beautiful. Everyone deserves love like this. Prejudice has no place here. Be happy." Clara, who woke up to a flurry of notifications on her cell phone, was in shock. When she saw the video, the tears came uncontrollably. Rosa, watching it, was also moved. For the first time, she saw Marcus as someone willing to fight for his daughter, no matter what the cost. With the support of thousands of people, Clara's life began to change. The suspicious looks gave way to smiles and words of encouragement. Marcus, for his part, began to make significant changes. He sold the mansion he had always considered a gilded prison and bought a cozier apartment full of life. He also began to invest his time in social projects, many of them led by Clara. Together, they created a program to offer free education to young people from underprivileged communities, fulfilling Clara's dream of transforming lives through teaching. Rosa, initially reticent, began to realize that Marcus was a different man. He was no longer the superficial millionaire she had met years ago. He had become someone more human, more present, more generous. She continued to work in the apartment, looking after him like a mother. She preferred it that way. A few months passed. Their love was growing stronger every day. So Marcus organized a small celebration in their new apartment. Rosa, Clara, and the whole family were present. After dinner, Marcus asked for the floor. "A few months ago I was lost," he began, looking directly at Clara. "I thought I had everything, but the truth was that I had nothing. Until I met you. Clara, you showed me what love is, what family is, and what happiness is." He knelt down, taking a small box out of his pocket. Clara put her hands to her face, completely surprised. "Clara, will you spend the rest of your life with me?" Tears flowed uncontrollably as Clara said yes in a choked voice. The room erupted in applause and laughter, and Rosa, in the corner, let out a sob of emotion. Over the next few months, Marcus and Clara married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by friends and family. They had built a life based on respect, love, and generosity. As they danced under the stars on their wedding night, Clara whispered, "I never imagined my life could be like this. You gave me everything." Marcus held her closer, his eyes shining. "No, Clara, it was you who gave me everything, and now we have everything together." Their love had withstood prejudices, judgments, and challenges, and together they proved that true love always wins. Did you like this moving story? What rating would you give this story? Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel To follow more stories full of drama, love, and overcoming, click on the one that appears on the screen. Oh, and a Merry Christmas full of love, peace, and joy to you and all your family. See you in the next video.